The first thing you notice is the way the marble drinks the sound. High smooth, a hush that makes laughter crack like glass. The crystal bloom ballroom glittered under a constellation of Venetian chandeliers, each crystal a tiny accusation. Champagne whispered in fluted glasses. Perfume trailed like a rumor. An orchestra swelled with the kind of music meant to make photographs look inevitable. In the middle of it all, where silk and sapphire mingled and camera lights hummed like indifferent insects, they laughed. They laughed at the woman in the teal dress. Her name was Ivy Laurent, and the laughter slid over her like rain over slate. No sound, no effect, except that it made the air colder around her. The dress was plainly cut, not tasteless but not notable either. She had chosen it for durability, for the way it moved without demanding attention. In one hand, she carried a small, plainly wrapped package tied with a twined bow, an offering of regard and a memory she refused to bury. In the other, unnoticeable until later, was a leather folder that would make some men's knees wobble. For now, she was simply the thing their eyelids wanted to dismiss. A former classmate, perhaps, or a charity volunteer, or worse. The kind of presence that made the privileged remind themselves how fortunate they were. "Is that one of the servers?" someone asked, half a snort and half a prayer. The bride, Evelyn Hart, glided forward like a practiced comet, her pearl-encrusted gown making the marble sing. Evelyn's smile was a machine learning to perfection, exactly timed, carefully calibrated. Behind her, bridesmaids formed a halo of designer looks. Cameras clicked, and a social media influencer barked delightedly into her arm, as if the evening's narrative were already stitched together. "Lovely," Evelyn said, stepping close enough to peer at the package, as if it were an irony. "How sweet. Are you lost, Miss Laurent?" A silence like a held breath. Ivy met Evelyn's eyes and felt none of the fear she imagined they hoped for. There was a flatness to her calm, not resignation, but a steadier thing. Someone who had spent her life learning how to carry weight without showing it. "I came to congratulate you," Ivy said. Her voice was soft but precise. "To bring a gift." Evelyn laughed then, a sound that set the room back in motion. "A gift? For us? How quaint." She tore at the paper in a practiced, gleeful rip that made the cameras purr. Inside lay a small carved wooden box, featherlight, the kind of object the poor keep and the wealthy dismiss. "Oh, stop," a bridesmaid said, Thea Marquez, arranging a jeweled hairpin with the gravity of coronation. "You always have the most rustic tastes." Laughter mapped the edges of the room like predatory teeth. Something tiny and almost invisible trembled in Ivy's hands. The wooden box was not a trinket. When Evelyn lifted it with a perfunctory sneer, it glinted, an antique enamel pin, the sort jewelry historians wrote about, a brooch once owned by a woman whose name was singed into the history of performance and struggle. Evelyn's nostrils flared, a calculation. "Thrift store," she murmured loud enough for a camera to catch the phrase. "How adorable." The waiter, in a black tailcoat, steadied a tray and brushed Ivy's sleeve. His elbow caught a champagne flute. Liquid leapt, threading down the teal fabric like an accusation. Someone muttered. Someone else laughed. "Security," a man's voice suggested, the word of verdict. A security guard approached with the helmeted earnestness of someone who had been taught to solve social discomfort with force. "Ma'am, we'll have to escort you out," he said, as if Ivy were a weather disturbance and not a human being. Ivy's lips curved once. It was a small, private thing. She did not resist as the guard's hand touched the small of her back. Her heels tapped a rhythm on the marble. The laughter rose to a cadence, faster, crueler. "You can go on gathering leftovers," Thea whispered. Maybe she thought it was an open buffet. A camera caught the moment. Fingers flew over keyboards. The joke mounted its little throne. Then the valet burst in. He was breathless like someone who'd had a different life half an hour ago and decided at the last second to return it. He leaned toward the hotel manager, who had learned to make panic look like protocol, and muttered something urgent. The manager's face folded into an expression the orchestra could not score: alarm. He strode to the guard, to Evelyn, to the bridal semicircle, and his voice, thin at first, cleared the room. "Stop," he said. The single word landed like a bell. Eyes flipped toward the doorway. Phones lowered. The breath in the room rearranged itself into a question mark. Ivy halted in the doorway, the guard's grip loosening. The manager bowed slightly, a motion that had more obeisance than authority. "Ms. Laurent," he said, the hospitality in his tone splintering. "I apologize for this. There's been a terrible mistake." A smile cracked on Evelyn's face, brittle as thin ice. "Well, who is she?" she snapped, voice loud enough for camera mics to reach. "Our caterer forgot to tell me about guests in teal." The manager swallowed. "Ms. Laurent is the owner of the Crystal Bloom Hotel." The room tilted. There are moments when a world recalibrates itself, when the axis of meaning pivots on a single syllable. For some of those in the ballroom, the shift was a social earthquake. For others, it was a subtle bruise. A hush that felt like paper being folded fell over the guests. Evelyn's smile lost its machinic sheen. Her cheeks flushed with the color of someone remembering an embarrassing childhood story and finding themselves the butt of it all. The laughter had been a performance whose script was suddenly in the wrong hands. Ivy's hands remained steady. "There's been a scheduling conflict," she said, to the manager as if he were her only companion in that floodlit theater. "Please, Jefferson, if you'll escort us to a private room on the 49th floor." She used his real name, and the manager's face crumpled into proper respect. He gestured. A corridor opened, and the elevator swallowed the three: a bride with a frozen smile, a stunned groom, and the woman they tried to eject. The conference room on the 49th floor had glass walls and a view that could make even cautious men confess to grander ambitions. The city sprawled below like a map someone had colored in gold. Ivy set the wooden box on the table and opened her leather folder. That was when the first major turning point unfurled, not as a loud proclamation, but as a slow reveal. Ivy was not interested in spectacle. She wanted to set accounts right. "Who is he?" Evelyn demanded, motioning to a man who had materialized silently from the doorway, a legal counsel with a calm that could be weaponized. Oliver Grant introduced himself as a legal and financial advisor for the Laurent Charitable Trust. He carried documents that felt heavier than their weight. Pages slid into view on the conference room screen when Ivy tapped a command. The documents were meticulous: ownership records, acquisitions, transfers. The Crystal Bloom Hotel, indeed, sat under the umbrella of the Laurent Holdings, one of many properties Ivy's foundation had purchased as part of a development strategy meant to preserve heritage spaces and redirect profits into community development. Evelyn's father, a man whose hands smelled faintly of perfumed envelopes and negotiation, had been negotiating to sell a controlling stake in his pharmaceutical chain the week prior. The buyer? An anonymous investor. The investor's shell folded into a holding company. The holding company folded into a trust. And there, in the bottom of the ledger like a pearl in dark water, was Ivy's signature. "You've been buying on a small scale for years," Evelyn said, disbelief smudging her composure. "I know many investors. I know the patterns." Ivy did not smile. "You know people who make appearances," she said. "I know what changes lives." Another twist appeared. The Laurent Trust portfolio included a majority stake in a pharmaceutical company that had supplied overpriced contracts to companies tied to Evelyn's family. Procurement lists, invoices, a web of transfers that opened into an ugly, bright truth. Money had been moved to create an illusion of charity and legitimacy, while the actual ledger told a story of graft and theft. The details unfolded like a slow-release sting. Evelyn's face turned chalky. She had always relied on the labor of social systems, on the idea that appearances could substitute for substance. Ivy's evidence was not a weapon so much as light. "You should be careful," Evelyn hissed. "You don't. I'm not here to destroy you," Ivy said. "I'm here to correct an injustice." That was the second turning point. Ivy's revelation was not merely about withholding dignity. It was about righting an elaborate wrong. The gathering upstairs, whose joy had been built on the currency of disdain, now teetered on the precipice of being consumed by a far more consequential currency, truth. The atmosphere in the ballroom had thickened into rumor. Someone had tweeted the manager's apology. A video, grainy, handheld, from a guest's phone had caught the moment of Ivy's escort and the manager's clarifying announcement. The story metastasized faster than anyone could blink. Hashtags were invented. Screenshots multiplied into threads. For many guests, it was panic wearing a new name. For others, cold calculation. When Ivy walked back into the ballroom 40 minutes later, the chorus of talk paused. The orchestra faltered and then resumed, artificially jaunty. Ivy moved differently now, not with the vulnerability of someone who expects to be dismissed, but with the precision of a woman who has decided to make the room listen. She carried herself like someone who had stolen time from the world and given it back, intact. She took the microphone offered by the manager. "Good evening," she said. Her voice filled the room without melodrama. "My name is Ivy Laurent." For a long beat, no one moved. Then Thea, whose laugh had been the loudest, clutched her champagne like a life preserver. "She can't be serious," she whispered. "Cameras found faces like bees finding pollen. Some of you will remember me as someone who volunteered at the community center on campus." Ivy continued. She spoke of the center not as a charity, but as a thing built and sustained across years, with no press releases, no grand openings, just the slow and often invisible labor of people who believed in something other than the self. "Other parts of my life have been quieter," she said. That choice was intentional. She told them, plainly and without relish, about her grandmother, a seamstress and an activist, a woman who had lent money in desperation to a family that later used forged documents to transfer the debt and erase the ledger. She spoke of a name that had been stolen and a legacy broken, of a brooch that had once belonged to a performer who had built her dignity in the face of a world eager to reduce her. The brooch in the wooden box was the last piece of a collection that had, in different hands, meant survival. Ivy lifted it, and cameras zoomed. Evelyn's breath left her like a puncture. "Justice is a dull thing," Ivy said, "if it only fits one time into one mouth." She set the brooch on the table with a kind of ceremonial gentleness. "I did not come to break you. I came because my grandmother's memory demanded that we not let small cruelties go unchecked." She then revealed the security footage, the third turning point. The cameras had recorded the proceedings from the moment she arrived until the moment the guard took her toward the door. They showed faces, laughter, and those who had mocked her. They showed the waiter's clumsy spill and the way some guests had sniffed and snickered. Ivy announced, calmly, that these recordings would be made available to the human resources departments of the companies represented in the room. Gasps stung the air like cold. A woman in the back, a public relations director who wrote statements about diversity initiatives for a living, dropped her glass. "This is extortion," a man muttered. Evelyn rose, fury curdling into panic. "You can't. This is my wedding." "You can call it whatever you like," Ivy said, "but I call it accountability." People who had been cruel faced immediate consequence. Brand managers on their phones, cancellation notices, the cold economic math of sponsors reconsidering whose faces they wanted associated with their products. Evelyn's carefully constructed sphere collapsed with a speed that was almost embarrassing to watch, like a dollhouse blown by a real wind. Her social accounts filled with angry comments and questions about her family's businesses. Invitations evaporated. Calls that had once promised collaborations went dark. The groom, Graham Pierce, sat in stunned silence. He had been raised to interpret loyalty as armor and the world as something his family bought. The news of the stake sale, the anonymous investor, the trust, made his skin feel too small. "I didn't know," he repeated over and over, the phrase a thin rope trying to knot in a reason. Ivy looked at him with neither cruelty nor softness. "People you love can lie," she said. "And when they do, truth has to come back." If that had been the end of it, Ivy could have taken her victory and retreated into a life no one could touch. But the revelation in the ballroom set off a chain of events Ivy had known might be painful and necessary. The fourth major twist was not a spectacle, but an inquiry. Once the cameras and the public attention had opened a fissure, investigators stepped through. Within a week, legal teams and auditors were involved. The family's assets were frozen under subpoena. Journalists, those native to spectacle, dug like miners who'd been promised a vein of honest ore. Stories emerged, contracts with inflated prices, shell companies used to route funds, grants promised and never delivered. Evelyn's father, a man with a certain old money disdain for being fingered, was called in for questioning. The groom's relationships with his father became sparser. His claim that he had been ignorant did little to help a public that loved either villains or martyrs, but did not much relish the in-between. Yet Ivy refused to make the affair solely punitive. Her motivation, if we strip away the theatricality, was restorative. She convened a meeting with community leaders, with workers who had been quietly exploited, with those who had lost savings or jobs because of shifty contracts. She used the Laurent Trust prominence and resources not as an image, but as a conduit for repair. Small businesses received emergency grants. A microfinance program was launched for entrepreneurs who had been excluded from traditional lending systems. The company that had once been a pirate of public funds was restructured, and part of its new mission, under the oversight of a board that now included community representatives, was to fund research in neglected diseases that affected marginalized populations. Graham Pierce, the groom, sought Ivy out. He was unmoored and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with public scrutiny and everything to do with the loss of an anchor. Over coffees and public statements, he found himself gravitating toward the life he had once wanted: medical research for underserved populations, something his father had mocked as naive. Ivy offered him a position within the Foundation's medical initiative, work that paid and had meaning, not the gilded appointments his family's network had previously offered. It was an irony that tasted almost like salvation for him. Evelyn's fate was less straightforward. For a time, she became a cautionary tale on talk shows and a trending hashtag. Sponsors abandoned her. Her brother, who had been an architect of many of the fraudulent contracts, vanished with funds that made headlines. Evelyn retreated, and for a while there were rumors that she'd fled abroad, that she'd taken a job as a boutique clerk. Actual details sometimes matter less than myth. Here the story diverges into two kinds of endings: the loud, public ruin and the quieter, human consequences. Ivy did not clap her hands at Evelyn's losses. She did not feel triumphant in the way their society taught triumph. Instead, she felt the slump of something that had been garnered in her chest, an exhaustion that comes when one has paid attention to the ledger of the world and decided to balance it. The climax of Ivy's story was not a courtroom victory nor a spectral social media execution. It occurred months later at a university convocation where she had been invited to speak. Universities like spectacle. There are also places where children from different strata meet and learn what the world expects of them. Ivy stood at the podium in a simple suit, no theatrics, no brooch displayed as a trophy. and told a story. She spoke of small debts that become genealogies, of a grandmother who sewed dresses and kept books of names like talismans, of the day Ivy had realized that dignity need not be purchased. She spoke not as a scold, but as a witness. Her words rippled through the auditorium. She did not ask the audience to hate those who had mocked her, but to remember that people are rarely only the stories they tell about themselves. She called for action, a program of restorative loans, legal aid clinics, and community-led auditing. Her plan did not sound like vengeance. It sounded like architecture. There was an eruption of applause, not the brittle kind, but the slow-building thunder of people moved. A student rose and asked if Ivy ever regretted making people suffer the way she had been made to suffer. Ivy's face softened. "Regret is a complex thing," she said. "There is no joy in watching a life collapse. But there is justice in correcting wrongs. And when justice is pursued thoughtfully, the result can be transformation rather than destruction." That evening, Ivy returned to her penthouse and placed the Josephine Baker brooch in a display case. Not on the shelf of a collector, but near a window where the light changed with the day. It was not a monument to revenge. It was a relic of survival. There are smaller, human aftershocks that matter in ways grand gestures cannot touch. Thea, who had laughed loudest, lost a significant endorsement contract when the PR fallout revealed her derisive comments. She had to confront what it meant to run a company that preached inclusion while practicing exclusion. Her brand survived, but it had to be rebuilt with accountability panels and a diversity board that was not just performative. Some people in the room lost their positions, others changed roles. Public humiliation is a blunt instrument. Institutional reform is a careful, slow machine. Graham found himself awake at odd hours, thinking about how fragile trust was. He called Ivy, not with contrition, but with an awkward request, to mentor him in the kind of work that had once seemed beneath him. Ivy agreed, on the condition that he listen more than speak. He learned to be quiet. That proved to be a generosity. Over time, they built a project to fund research in under-resourced clinics, a project that bore his name in part and the trust's oversight in full. Evelyn, for a while, was everywhere in the worst ways, screaming headlines, pitying think pieces. But scandalous short memory. In time, a sobering truth took seat in her life. No one could buy back the trust she had squandered with a single cruel laugh. She tried to apologize publicly. Her sincerity, filtered through public opinion and the sticky residue of her actions, failed to land. There was a private conversation, face-to-face, between Ivy and Evelyn months later, in a city cafe far from the press. Evelyn was smaller than the photographs. She had aged not from time, but from the particular dryness of remorse. "I don't expect forgiveness," Evelyn said. Her voice had the brittle quality of something that had been singed. "I don't deserve it." Ivy stirred her tea, fingers folded around the cup like a quiet measure. "I never wanted to ruin you," she said. "But we must be careful with other people's dignity. We either protect it, or we pay for its loss." Evelyn left town months later, under the radar. Rumors claimed a new name, a new life that might include humble labor and a necessary humility. Some nights, Ivy would find herself thinking of Evelyn not with hatred, but with the odd, complicated tenderness one reserves for a person who is human and made terrible choices. The Laurent trust grew in influence, but not in ostentation. Ivy insisted on the work being visible not as a parade, but as a scaffolding, fastening supports where systems had been rotten. It was not a neat, cinematic triumph. It was messy, bureaucratic, sometimes infuriating. Ivy sat through meetings where grant proposals were debated, where power made its soft offers, where the temptation to display rather than to do reappeared like an old friend. She resisted. She remembered her grandmother's hands. She remembered the brooch and why it mattered. Years later, at a small ceremony to open a new community health center in the East Sector, the place where Ivy had grown up, children ran across tiles she had helped restore. Neighborhood women she had known since she was a child served the refreshments. The ribbon was cut. Cameras recorded, but did not dictate. Ivy stood on the edge and watched the life she had been building with unflashy attention. She felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of closure that was not the end of a revenge arc, but the slow accretion of good work. That night, she walked home past the storefronts she had once looked at in hunger and hope. She paused under a streetlight and opened the velvet case that held the brooch. It glinted in the yellow halo, a small, private cosmos. She brushed it with her fingertip and smiled, not triumphantly, but with the kind of peace that comes when you have made a difficult choice and kept your hands clean of malice. Justice, she had learned, is not a spectacle. It is a set of commitments to truth, to repair, and to the stubborn work that follows headlines. The people who had mocked her would live with the consequences. Some would learn, others would forget. Ivy could not control that. She could control the direction of her work, the lives she chose to uplift, and the stories she chose to tell. In the end, the ballroom became a cautionary parable in the city's lore, less for the spectacle and more for the lesson that appearances could not hold up forever. Ivy Laurent returned to her days running initiatives and reading long, dull contracts with a steady eye. She served on panels and avoided the red carpets. The people she helped, small business owners, clinic nurses, students who had been granted a small but life-changing loan, knew her not as the woman who had humiliated a bride, but as the one who'd quietly kept the doors open. One of them sent her, months later, a photograph of a little girl in a teal dress, playing in front of a clinic with a bandage on her knee and a grin like sunlight. Ivy kept that photograph on her desk. Sometimes, in the quiet between meetings, she would find her fingers brushing the edges of a ledger, remembering how fragile dignity can be if left to the mercy of others. She would think of the ballroom and the way the light had shifted when truth walked in. She would remember, too, her grandmother's hands, calloused and precise, and say a small thanks into the soft air of the office. The brooch remained, not as a trophy, but as a promise, that when dignity was insulted, when cruelty paraded as cleverness, there were ways to answer that did not cost her soul. Ivy Laurent had been mocked, let out, and then welcomed back, not because she craved spectacle, but because she had insisted on what mattered. She carried the weight of her choices like a ledger balanced, ready for the next page.